Hello and welcome back to F1 Every Week. I am your host Ben Wevel, and today I'm going to be analysing and reviewing this weekend's Belgian Grand Prix, round 14 of the 2022 Formula 1 World Championship, and the first race back from a very eventful summer break. The Grand Prix has been on the F1 World Championship calendar since the very beginning of the sport, but the infamous Spa-Francorchamps has been interlinked with motorsport since all the way back in 1925, the first Grand Prix ever to take place in Belgium, being won by the father of two-time world champion and also double winner at Spa, Alberto Ascari. The race has been held exclusively at Spa, apart from a period of just over a decade from the early 70s to the early 80s, where Nivelles-Bollard and, more infamously, the Zolder circuit played host to the Grand Prix as well. Michael Schumacher has been victorious 6 times at the circuit, closely followed by Ayrton Senna. And also interestingly, for 3 decades between 1988 and 2018, only German, British, Finnish and Brazilian drivers were victorious at Spa, with the exception of Daniel Ricciardo in 2014. Mercedes, though, have been on top in the last few years, with 4 wins in the last 7 Belgian Grand Prix. But this track centres on power, as drivers are going at full throttle for the vast majority of the lap. And despite power having been the greatest strength of Mercedes in the previous era of F1, they have struggled in that respect so far this year, while Ferrari and Red Bull have flourished. You can listen to the podcast on the streaming platform of your choice, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Now, without further ado, let's get in to episode 70. There was a boatload of news coming into the Belgian Grand Prix, the first and most important of which being Daniel Ricciardo's announcement that he would be leaving McLaren at the end of the 2022 season in a video posted to Instagram and Twitter. He described the termination of his contract after 2 seasons as bittersweet, due to the extensive payout which he'll be receiving for this contract termination, and McLaren CEO Zak Brown said that he had hoped the two of them could achieve more together. The most probable move at the moment is for Oscar Piastri to take Daniel's place, but let's not forget that there is still a chance that the FIA could find Oscar's contract with Alpine still valid, meaning that McLaren would be in a real pickle. Interestingly, after the Grand Prix had concluded, Lando Norris seemed to let slip that there would be a confirmation in the coming days that Oscar Piastri would be driving for McLaren next year. But again, it's just speculation, and he could have been mincing his words somewhat. But from Daniel's side, he was apparently offered the opportunity to stay with McLaren in a different area of motorsport, such as Formula E. But he said in the press conference on Thursday that at this point in his career, F1 was the only real option. Furthermore, in an interview with Sky Sports, he commented on being open to the idea of rejoining Alpine in 2023 if they were able to give him, quote-unquote, a competitive car. McLaren themselves added a number of upgrades this weekend to get accustomed to the top speed-centred track, such as a new rear wing, cooling loops, and more, which kept them as comfortably the 4th quickest car this season so far, with Lando Norris taking a confident P3 and P4 respectively in the final 2 practice sessions. Coming back to the driver market, and there were some rumblings from Gunther Steiner in the lead-up to the race and in the first practice session in regards to their possibilities next season. Steiner has criticised Mick Schumacher as of late for his lack of point-scoring ability, citing Daniel Ricciardo as a genuine option for next season, as well as Daniel doing the same in that interview that I mentioned earlier. Despite the fact that Haas at the moment definitely don't have the money to afford the Aussie at his current rate. However, if Daniel is rejected by Alpine in favour of a driver such as Mick, Daniel may have to settle with a less monetarily motivated seat. Things were thrown further into the air by the announcement that Antonio Giovinazzi will be driving for Haas in FP1 in both Italy and the United States, which could connote a move away from Formula E and towards Haas, away from his previous links with Alfa Romeo. This move from Daniel, combined with the comments from Gunther, means the F1 silly season is still in full swing. Now onto the other big news piece going into the weekend, the announcement that Aldi will be joining F1 as a power unit supplier at the start of the 2026 season, in line with the new regulations set for that season. They are likely to partner with Alfa Romeo Sauber, while fellow Volkswagen Group-owned Porsche are expected to provide for Red Bull in 2026 after Honda are expected to leave the sport outright. This announcement expected anytime soon. As well as this, merely hours after the announcement from Aldi, Alfa Romeo announced that they would no longer be the title sponsors of the Sauber team from 2024 onwards, after only 4 seasons back in the sport. Next up is Mercedes, who introduced a new rear wing, as well as a new front wing end plate design, and despite what I was saying at the start of the show about the lack of power being a detriment, Mercedes may have gone into the Grand Prix with a boost of confidence, as the flexi floors, which were employed by their rivals Red Bull and Ferrari, which Toto Wolff complained about at length, were banned from this weekend onwards, thanks to a tweak to the regulations by the FIA. Mercedes themselves have been using rigid floors all season long and have suffered hugely with porpoising as a result. So this change should have brought the team closer to the front of the pack. But there was a clear lack of pace on Friday, as Lewis Hamilton finished 9th and 6th in his practice sessions. George Russell remaining optimistic despite the unsatisfactory day, pointing out the fact that the team have come back from a bad Friday before. Unfortunately, the Silver Arrows, who were sporting a throwback livery celebrating 55 years of their parent company AMG, would have to contend with a difficult Saturday morning as well, with Lewis Hamilton ending up down in 12th. Aston Martin are up next, and despite Sebastian Vettel snagging the headlines prior to the summer break with the announcement of his retirement, it was Lance Stroll who was lighting up the timing screens across all 3 free practice sessions, as he put in a time good enough for the top 5 in both FP1 and FP2. This is all thanks to upgrades on Lance's car, which were not afforded to Seb, who was significantly lower down on the timing sheets. Despite his positive form in free practice, qualifying is where it counts, and the last time Stroll was given upgrades, which Vettel did not get, the Canadian ended up down in P18 on Saturday afternoon. Next, for some very good news for fans of the sport in general, as Stefano Domenicali announced prior to the race on Sunday that Spa would be returning for another season next year. Some were concerned going into the weekend that Spa would not retain its place on the calendar, as France was announced that it would not come back for another year on Friday. However, Stefano assured the F1 fans around the world that Spa would make a return. Now, I'm personally very thankful to see this come to fruition, because, as many have said this weekend, we don't want the entire calendar filled up with these new street circuits. And as Martin Brundle pointed out, the whole point of Formula 1 is to have a variety of challenges. And finally, for the pre-qualifying news, are the swathes of grid penalties which came into play across the weekend. as Norris, Ocon, Zhou and Schumacher were all set to start from the back of the grid, with Valtteri Bottas set to start just ahead of the bunch with a 25-place grid penalty, instead of a back-of-the-grid penalty. All of these penalties were thanks to new power unit elements, which surpassed the legal limit for this season. But alongside these midfield drivers, both Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc also took back-of-the-grid penalties, meaning that both the fight for pole and the race itself would be hopefully as enticing as things to come. Now on to qualifying, and after a delay due to a big dent in the barriers caused by quite an unusual crash in the Porsche supercar race earlier on Saturday, a cold Q1 began. Max Verstappen was predictably fastest in the first qualifying session, while the Mercs struggled significantly, unable to find any pace, their car looking as stiff as a rod. But they were saved from another Q2 exit by virtue of Sebastian Vettel, who was out in Q2 in Belgium for the first time since his maiden season in 2007, Nicholas Latifi, Kevin Magnussen, the man who has his hopes rested on in qualifying, with teammate Mick Schumacher progressing to Q2 despite ending up at the back of the grid due to those grid penalties, Yuki Tsunoda and Valtteri Bottas, who was out in Q1 for the first time since Monaco 2015. Now onto Q2, and Leclerc struck back, with Max Verstappen nearly 2/10 off the Monegasque's time of 1:44.5. Daniel Ricciardo disappointed in 11th after the announcement that he would be leaving the team of McLaren, with his worst qualifying performance in Belgium in nearly a decade. A stark contrast to that glorious victory from the Aussie in Spa back in 2014. Pierre Gasly was in 12th and Zhou in 13th was set to start from the back of the grid. Stroll and Schumacher rounded out the top 15 as well. Finally for Q3, and Max Verstappen was the fastest man in qualifying, with a blistering time of 1:43.6. Over 6/10 up on the next closest man, Carlos Sainz, who would start on pole on Sunday afternoon, for the second time in his career and the second time this season, due to the grid penalty coming the way of Max Verstappen. Sergio Perez put in the third best time of qualifying, his best performance in quali in his Spa career. Leclerc came in at 4th after a mistake-ridden final session, again thanks to his own team rather than Leclerc himself, as the Monegasque, who was set to provide a slipstream for his teammate Carlos Sainz to help him achieve pole, instead was put on an incorrect set of the soft compound tyres. Alpine locked out the third row before penalties were applied, with Hamilton and Russell 7th and 8th. A very disappointing result after such high expectations coming into the weekend. Toto Wolff went even as far as to say that this qualifying was the team's worst in 10 years. Alex Albon secured his first Q3 qualifying this season in 9th, with Lando Norris, who would take a penalty, rounding out the top 10. So, once all penalties were applied, the order on the grid was Sainz, Perez, Alonso, the two Mercs, Albon, who took Williams' best grid spot in years, Daniel Ricciardo, Gasly, the two Astons, Latifi, and Magnussen in P12. Now for the drivers who took penalties. P13 was Bottas, followed by Verstappen, Leclerc, Ocon, Norris, Zhou, and Schumacher, with Yuki Tsunoda forced to start from the pit lane after his car was operated upon under parc fermé conditions. Now for my driver of qualifying, and I'm going to be analysing the drivers mostly upon their pace in quali rather than their grid positions. But even with that in mind, I'm putting Alex Albon here. Unlike his teammate Latifi in Great Britain, Alex Albon achieved his phenomenal P9